You don't know what I had done to my mind, Fuchs said. On the morning before his trial, Fuchs met with his lawyer in a prison cell beneath the courthouse. The lawyer, Derek Curtis Bennett, warned Fuchs to brace himself. He was likely to be given the maximum penalty allowed by law. You know what that is? Curtis Bennett asked. Yes, said Fuchs. It's death. No, you bloody fool, it's 14 years. Fuchs was confused. You didn't give secrets to an enemy, the lawyer said. You gave them to an ally. During World War II, Britain and the Soviet Union had been fighting on the same side. In the eyes of British law, Curtis Bennett explained, that made all the difference. If Fuchs had committed treason to help an enemy, he'd face the death penalty. But the maximum sentence for passing secrets to an ally was 14 years in prison. After a trial lasting just 2 hours, Fuchs was given 14 years. He was released from prison in 1959 thanks to a reduction in sentence for good behavior. He moved to the communist East Germany where he got married and continued atomic research. Fuchs died in 1988 at the age of 76. As soon as the FBI found incriminating papers in his bedroom, Harry Gold cracked wide open. 17 years of secrets came pouring out. Every time you squeeze him, there's some juice left, said one of the interrogating agents. Here's where the huge mistake made 5 years before by the KGB came back to bite them. When Gold went to New Mexico in June 1945, he had orders from his KGB handler, Anatoly Yakov, to pick up information from both Klaus Fuchs and a second source, David Greenglass. By doing this, Gold cross-contaminated 2 separate spy rings he learned about and was therefore capable of exposing 2 different operations. That's exactly what happened. Gold told the FBI about Greenglass, who was arrested and questioned. Greenglass identified the people who had recruited him to spy for the Soviets, Julius and Ethan Rosenberg. In the most famous espionage trial of the century, the Rosenbergs were found guilty of helping to pass vital national secrets to the Soviets. They were sentenced to death. Under American law, the fact that the Soviets were not enemies at the time the information was exchanged did not save them. The trial exposed the names of Soviet agents, and many had to flee the country. The KGB continued to spy on America, of course, but they were never again as effective as they had been during World War II. Gold's confession in the Rosenberg trial also helped ignite the Red Scare of the 1950s, an obsessive hunt for communists everywhere in American society. Gold watched it from his jail cell. By cooperating with authorities, he avoided the electric chair, getting a 30-year sentence instead. I am calm, he said during his prison term, and my mind is at peace for the first time in more than a decade and a half. Gold was paroled from prison in 1965. He returned home to Philadelphia, where he died in 1972 at the age of 61. Ted Hall was the one who got away. After the war, Hall decided to return to school and began working toward his PhD in physics at the University of Chicago. There, he met and fell in love with a student named Joan. Hall's approach was different from Gold's. Rather than live with secrets, he took Joan to her bedroom and shut the door. He looked around the small room nervously. You don't have any microphones in here, do you? He asked. She assured him she didn't. They sat on the bed and Ted told her everything. They were married soon after. 3 years later, the Army codebreakers who had exposed Klaus Fuchs found another curious telegram sent to KGB headquarters during World War II. It had been sent from New York City to Moscow in late 1944. The message described Ted Hall's meeting with the Soviet journalist and agent Sergei Kurnkov at Kurnkov's New York apartment, the meeting at which the 19-year-old Hall had first offered himself as a spy. The information was passed on to the FBI's Chicago office. On March 16, 1951, Agent Robert McQueen dropped by Hall's lab at the university. He said he needed Hall's help with a matter pertaining to the security of the United States. Hall agreed to come to McQueen's office and answer a few questions. The moment he began questioning Hall, McQueen knew he'd met his match. I think he was very bright, McQueen recalled. Very, very bright. Expecting this day to come, Hall had long ago prepared his story. When McQueen pulled out a photo of Sergei Kurnkov, Hall calmly said he knew of Kurnkov's articles but had never met the man. Hour after hour, the questions grew more intense. McQueen finally came out and accused Hall of spying. Hall seemed confused by the charge but not greatly upset. Quite calm for his age, McQueen noted. Too calm, the agent thought. An innocent man usually says, "Why are you asking me these questions?" Hall never protested. He answered the questions, then got up to leave. McQueen asked if he'd be willing to come back for another interview. "No," said Hall. He had nothing more to say. The FBI knew Hall was guilty, and Hall knew they knew. But all the government had on Hall was the decoded KGB cable, and they didn't want to use that in court. Hall guessed that this was the case. He simply refused to talk with the FBI, and they had no legal way to force him. That didn't stop FBI agents from opening Hall's mail and tapping his home phone and following him everywhere. "We knew there was a definite chance that the world was going to collapse around us," Joan Hall remembered. She and Ted lived in fear for a couple of years, but slowly, over time, the FBI gave up. In 1962, the Halls, with their 3 young children, moved to Britain, where Hall went to work in a lab at Cambridge University. It was not until 1995, when the KGB's decoded messages were finally made public, that Hall was exposed. When the reporters came to his house to question him, he admitted contact with the Soviet agents but declined to discuss details. "If confronted with the same problem today," Hall acknowledged, "I would respond quite differently." Hall lived another 4 years, dying at the age of 74. After leaving Los Alamos, Robert Oppenheimer moved east, taking over as director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. He also continued working in Washington, D.C., where he served as a scientific advisor to the government on atomic energy policy. That's where he got in trouble. The Soviet bomb test in 1949 seriously intensified the Cold War, the growing global rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union that followed World War II. The United States faced a major decision. Now that the Soviets had the atomic bomb, should the Americans try to build an even more devastating weapon? While working at Los Alamos, Oppenheimer and other top scientists had discussed the possibility of building what they called the super. This would be a new kind of bomb, not based on splitting atoms. The super would get its energy from fusion, or the joining of atoms. At the extreme temperatures and pressures inside the sun and other stars, hydrogen atoms are fused together. This fusion process creates helium atoms and releases vast amounts of energy. It is fusion that powers the stars. In theory, scientists realized it would be possible to recreate this process inside a bomb. Hydrogen could be put inside a fission bomb, like the ones used in Japan. When the fission bomb exploded, the heat and pressure should be great enough to cause the fusion of hydrogen atoms. The power of such a bomb would have almost no limit. The more hydrogen you add, the bigger the blast. In October 1949, Oppenheimer and other scientific advisors sat down to discuss the hydrogen bomb. Would the bomb really work? Probably, the scientists agreed. Would building it make America safer? No, they argued. The United States already had bombs powerful enough to wipe out the Soviet cities. Building even bigger bombs would only heat up the arms race with the Soviets. The Soviets would respond by building bigger bombs themselves, putting Americans in greater danger. Oppenheimer argued that now was the time to step back from the arms race, not accelerate it. "We believe a super bomb should never be produced," Oppenheimer wrote on behalf of the scientists. Another Los Alamos leader, Hans Bethe, added his own argument. "I believe the most important question is the moral one," he said. "Can we, who have always insisted on morality and human decencies between nations, as well as inside our own country, introduce this weapon of total annihilation to the world?" President Truman saw it differently. The Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin was proving to be ruthless and untrustworthy. It would be dangerous, even irresponsible, Truman figured, to let Soviets become more powerful than the United States. And, as always, there was a political angle. If the Soviets got the hydrogen bomb first, American voters might blame the president who'd let it happen. When it came time to make the decision, Truman had one question about the hydrogen bomb. Can the Russians do it? "Yes," said his advisors. "In that case, we have no choice. We'll go ahead." On January 31st, 1950, Truman announced that the country was moving forward with work on the hydrogen bomb. "We keep saying we have no other course," lamented Truman's advisor, David Lilienthal. What we should be saying is we are not bright enough to see any other course. Albert Einstein, who had first alerted President Roosevelt to the possibility of building atomic bombs, was deeply disturbed. If successful, he said, radioactive poisoning of the atmosphere and hence annihilation of any life on Earth has been brought within the range of technical possibilities. On November 1st, 1952, on a tiny island in the South Pacific, the United States tested the world's first hydrogen bomb. It exploded with the incredible force of 10 megatons of TNT. That's 10 million tons of TNT, more than 500 times more powerful than the bomb that flattened Hiroshima. Less than a year later, in Kazakhstan, the Soviets successfully tested their first hydrogen bomb. From this point on, there could be no such thing as winning a nuclear war. We may be likened to two scorpions in a bottle, Oppenheimer wrote in a 1953 article, each capable of killing the other, but only at the risk of his own life. Quotes like this got Oppenheimer into trouble. They particularly annoyed Lewis Strauss, chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, the government agency in charge of the country's atomic energy policy. Strauss argued that Oppenheimer's opposition to the H-bomb was an act of disloyalty to America. He suggested that maybe Oppenheimer had always been disloyal. As evidence, he dug up those flimsy charges the Army and the FBI had investigated 10 years before, that Oppenheimer was secretly a communist and maybe even a Soviet spy. Strauss devised a plan for taking Oppenheimer down. He'd have the AEC strip Oppenheimer of his security clearance. Without his clearance, Oppenheimer would no longer be allowed to see secret information on the latest atomic weapons research. He couldn't advise the government because he wouldn't know what was going on. Oppenheimer had two options: demand a hearing or simply walk away. He knew by now that nothing he did or said could stop the arms race, but there was a principle involved. He couldn't let the charges against him go unchallenged. This course of action, he told Strauss, would mean that I accept and concur in the view that I am not fit to serve this government, that I have now served for some 12 years. This I cannot do. Oppenheimer got his hearing, but it was a bogus from the start. Strauss personally picked the panel of judges. The FBI tapped Oppenheimer's phones and listened in on conversations between him and his attorney. This illegally gathered information was used against Oppenheimer in court. Strauss and his head lawyer, Roger Robb, came up with two main lines of attack. First, they argued that Oppenheimer objected to the hydrogen bomb and was therefore helping to weaken America. Second, that Oppenheimer had never come clean about the so-called Chevalier incident. This was a time in late 1942 when Oppenheimer's friend, Hakon Chevalier, had come to his house and mentioned that a Soviet agent he knew would be interested in any scientific information Oppenheimer might like to share. Oppenheimer had hashed it all out with Army security officers back in 1943. But now Robb suggested that Oppenheimer had never told the whole truth about the Chevalier incident. If the incident had really been so innocent, Robb asked, why hadn't Oppenheimer reported it to Leslie Groves right away? Robb was clearly implying that Oppenheimer had closer contact with the Soviets than he was admitting. The judges were swayed. They voted to revoke Oppenheimer's security clearance. Dr. Oppenheimer is not entitled to the continued confidence of the government, declared the AEC. Oppenheimer was only 50 years old, but friends said he suddenly looked older. I think it broke his spirit, really, Robert Serber said of the ruling. I think to a certain extent it actually almost killed him spiritually, agreed Isidore Rabbi. It achieved what his opponents wanted to achieve. It destroyed him. During the hearing, a friend mentioned that Oppenheimer, with his scientific reputation, would be welcome at any top university in Europe. Why not go? Tears glazed Oppenheimer's eyes as he said, Damn it, I happen to love this country. Even after the hearing, the FBI continued listening in on Oppenheimer's phone calls. When he and his family flew to the Caribbean island of St. John for vacation, agents kept watch. According to the plan declared on one FBI report,